Eliza Dawson stared at her reflection in the cracked mirror. Her plump cheeks flushed with embarrassment as the echo of laughter still rang in her ears from another cruel joke at her expense. In Silver City, New Mexico Territory, 1876, being a woman of substantial size made her an easy target for the town's ridicule. But Eliza held onto a quiet dignity that even the harshest whispers couldn't completely destroy. Silver City had sprung up just a few years earlier when silver deposits were discovered in the southwestern territory. The mining town grew rapidly, attracting fortune seekers, merchants, and those looking for a fresh start. Eliza had arrived 3 years ago after her parents' passing in St. Louis, hoping to build a new life with her aunt who owned the town's only bakery. At 24, Eliza had resigned herself to a life of whispers and sidelong glances. Her fingers smoothed down the fabric of her dress, specially sewn to accommodate her figure. Despite the town's unkindness, she took pride in her appearance, always ensuring her auburn hair was neatly pinned and her clothes were clean and presentable. "Eliza, the morning batch needs tending," her aunt called from downstairs. "Coming, Aunt Harriet," she replied, taking one last glance at her reflection before heading down to the bakery. The sweet aroma of fresh bread enveloped her as she descended the stairs to Harriet's sweet delights. The bakery was Eliza's sanctuary, where her hands created delicacies that even the cruelest townsfolk couldn't resist. Her pies, in particular, had earned a reputation throughout the territory, though few would openly compliment the baker herself. Eliza tied an apron around her ample waist and set to work, kneading dough with practiced movements. The rhythmic pushing and folding always calmed her nerves, especially after mornings like this one when Mrs. Abernathy and her circle of friends had snickered openly as Eliza passed by on her way to collect fresh eggs from the miller's farm. The bell above the door jingled, announcing the day's first customer. Eliza kept her eyes on her work, leaving Aunt Harriet to handle the front of the shop. "Well, if it isn't Marshall Hayes," Aunt Harriet's voice carried a warmth reserved for her favorite customers. "What brings you to my humble establishment so early this morning?" Eliza's hands faltered for just a moment. Marshall Hayes had arrived in Silver City 6 months ago, taking up the role of deputy to the aging Sheriff Cooper. At 32, he'd already built a reputation as a fair but firm lawman. Unlike many of the miners and cowboys who frequented the town, he carried himself with a quiet confidence that didn't require boasting or bravado. "Miss Harriet," his deep voice resonated through the small shop, "I've been dreaming about your apple turnovers since I woke up." "Oh, you flatterer," Aunt Harriet laughed. "Eliza just pulled a fresh batch from the oven. Eliza, dear, bring out those turnovers for the deputy." Reluctantly, Eliza wiped her flour-covered hands on her apron and gathered the pastries onto a tray. She took a deep breath before pushing through the swinging door that separated the kitchen from the shop. Marshall Hayes stood tall at the counter, his brown hat held respectfully in his hands. His dark hair was slightly damp, as though he'd just washed up, and his clean-shaven face broke into a genuine smile when he saw Eliza. "Miss Dawson," he nodded politely, his blue eyes meeting hers directly. "Deputy," she replied softly, setting the tray on the counter and keeping her gaze lowered as she arranged the turnovers in the display case. "I heard tell your cherry pie took first prize at the county fair last month," he commented. "Quite an achievement." Eliza glanced up, surprised. Most people in town conveniently forgot to mention her accomplishments. "Thank you. It was my mother's recipe. She must have been an exceptional baker to have taught you so well." A blush crept across Eliza's cheeks. She wasn't accustomed to compliments, especially not from men like Marshall Hayes, men whose physical appearance caused young women to swoon and older women to cluck approvingly. Aunt Harriet, ever the businesswoman, intervened. "Deputy, we're preparing a special order of pies for the town meeting tonight. Perhaps you'd care to reserve one." "I would indeed," he said, his eyes still on Eliza. "What varieties are you offering, Miss Dawson? Apple, cherry, and blackberry," Eliza replied, finding her voice. "The blackberries were picked just yesterday." "Then blackberry it is." He paid for his turnovers and the pie reservation, tipping his hat as he left. "Ladies, a pleasure as always." When the door closed behind him, Aunt Harriet turned to Eliza with a knowing smile. "That man has come in 3 times this week, and each time he asks specifically about your baking." "He's just being polite, Aunt Harriet." Eliza dismissed the observation, though a small flutter of hope rose in her chest. "Politeness doesn't require a man to ride all the way from the other side of town before his shift begins, just for a turnover," her aunt replied sagely. Eliza shook her head and returned to the kitchen, unwilling to entertain such foolish thoughts. Men like Marshall Hayes didn't court women like her. That was simply how the world worked. The day progressed with its usual rhythm of baking, serving customers, and enduring the occasional unkind remark disguised as casual conversation. Mrs. Penelope White, wife of the bank owner, came in with her daughter Charlotte, both of them eyeing Eliza with barely concealed disdain as they ordered tea cakes. "My goodness, Eliza, don't you just envy Charlotte's new dress? Came all the way from San Francisco, Mrs. White said, her voice dripping with false sweetness. "Of course they don't make such fine things in your size." Charlotte giggled behind her gloved hand, her slender figure deliberately straightening to emphasize the contrast between them. Eliza wrapped their order with steady hands. "It's lovely indeed. That will be 30 cents, Mrs. White." Just as Mrs. White was about to respond with another barbed comment, the door opened and Marshall Hayes entered again, this time with Sheriff Cooper. "Afternoon, ladies," the sheriff greeted, nodding to the Whites before turning to Eliza. "Miss Dawson, I heard your pies will be at the meeting tonight. Looking forward to it." "Thank you, Sheriff," Eliza responded, handing the package to Mrs. White, who now wore an expression of calculated politeness. "Deputy Hayes was just telling me about your blue ribbon from the county fair," Sheriff Cooper continued. "Said it was well-deserved." Marshall nodded in agreement. "Best pie I've ever tasted, and I've traveled quite a bit." Mrs. White's smile tightened. "Well, we must be going. Charlotte has her fitting at Mrs. Miller's." She practically pulled her daughter out of the shop, leaving a strained silence in their wake. Sheriff Cooper ordered coffee and a slice of peach pie, while Marshall requested the same. Both men sat at one of the small tables by the window, discussing town business while Eliza served them. "The situation with the Mason brothers needs addressing," Sheriff Cooper said quietly. 3 cattle stolen from the Henderson Ranch last week." Marshall nodded, his expression serious. "I'll ride out tomorrow, see if I can track them. Be careful, they're not above shooting a lawman." Eliza set down their coffee and pie, trying not to eavesdrop but concerned by what she'd heard. The Mason brothers were notorious troublemakers who lived in the foothills north of town. "Thank you, Miss Dawson," Marshall said, his smile returning. "Will you be attending the meeting tonight?" Eliza hesitated. She rarely attended town functions, preferring to avoid the stares and whispers. "I'll be delivering the pies, but I don't usually stay." "That's a shame," he said, his gaze direct and unfaltering. "I'd appreciate your perspective on the school matter they're discussing." Sheriff Cooper looked between them with interest before focusing on his pie. "This is exceptional, Miss Dawson." "You're too kind, Sheriff," she replied, retreating to the safety of the kitchen. Later that afternoon, as Eliza prepared the pies for the town meeting, she considered Marshall's invitation. It wasn't precisely an invitation, she reminded herself, merely a polite suggestion. Yet something in his eyes had seemed genuine, lacking the mockery she was accustomed to seeing. "You should go," Aunt Harriet said, seemingly reading her thoughts. "It's about time this town heard your voice on matters affecting its future." "They don't want to hear from me, Aunt Harriet." "Nonsense. You're as much a citizen of Silver City as anyone else. More than some, I'd wager, considering how much your baking contributes to town functions without a word of thanks." Eliza sighed, crimping the edge of a pie crust with practiced fingers. I'll think about it. As twilight descended on Silver City, Eliza helped load the pies into Aunt Harriet's wagon. She had decided to attend the meeting after all, though her stomach knotted with anxiety at the prospect. She wore her best dress, a deep blue calico that Aunt Harriet had helped her sew last Christmas, and had arranged her hair in a simple but elegant style. The town hall was already crowded when they arrived. Men in their Sunday best stood in groups, discussing cattle prices and mining claims, while women clustered together, exchanging the latest gossip. Eliza felt the familiar weight of stares as she carried the pies to the table at the back of the room. "Here, let me help you with those," a voice offered, and she looked up to find Marshall beside her, reaching for the heavy tray. "Thank you, Deputy," she said, relinquishing the pies and trying to ignore the curious glances from nearby townsfolk. "Marshall, please," he corrected with a smile. "We're not on official business here," she nodded, unsure how to respond to such familiarity from someone of his standing. "I should join my aunt, of course, but save me a slice of that blackberry pie, won't you?" His eyes crinkled at the corners when he smiled. Eliza noticed, giving him a boyish charm that contrasted with his otherwise serious demeanor. "I will," she promised, hurrying to where Aunt Harriet had secured seats near the middle of the room. The meeting began with Mayor Thornton addressing the usual town business repairs needed for the bridge over Miller's Creek, complaints about the stray dogs near the saloon, and updates on the railroad expansion that promised to bring more prosperity to Silver City. Then came the matter of the school. The current schoolhouse was too small for the growing population of children, and the town needed to decide whether to expand the existing building or construct a new one entirely. The debate grew heated, with various factions arguing for their preferred locations. Some wanted the new school built near the more affluent north side of town, while others advocated for a central location accessible to all children, including those from the poorer mining families. "The children from respectable families shouldn't have to mix with just anyone," Mrs. White declared, her chin tilted upward. "A proper education requires proper company." Several heads nodded in agreement, particularly among the wealthier townspeople. Marshall stood then, his tall frame commanding attention. "With respect, Mrs. White, I believe every child in Silver City deserves an equal opportunity for education. The purpose of a school is to lift up all children, not just those born to privilege." A murmur spread through the crowd, some approving, others less so. "And where would you suggest this school be built, Deputy Hayes?" Mayor Thornton asked. "The parcel of land behind the church is centrally located and large enough to accommodate a proper schoolhouse with room for expansion," Marshall replied. "It would be accessible to all neighborhoods." Mayor Thornton nodded thoughtfully. "Does anyone else wish to speak on this matter?" Eliza felt Aunt Harriet's elbow gently nudge her ribs. Taking a deep breath, she raised her hand. "Miss Dawson," the mayor acknowledged, surprise evident in his voice. Eliza stood, acutely aware of the many eyes upon her. Her heart pounded, but she forced herself to speak clearly. "I believe Deputy Hayes is right about the location. Additionally, I would suggest that the new school include a proper kitchen. Many children come to school hungry, especially those whose parents work the early shift at the mines. A hot meal would improve their ability to learn." The room fell silent, and for a moment, Eliza feared she had overstepped. Then Mrs. Cooper, the sheriff's wife, spoke up. "That's an excellent point, Miss Dawson. I've noticed several children sharing their lunches with classmates who have none. Where would the funds for such meals come from?" Someone called out. "I would be willing to provide baked goods once a week," Eliza offered, "and perhaps other businesses could contribute similarly." To her surprise, several business owners nodded in agreement, including Mr. Franklin from the general store and even Mr. White from the bank, though his wife looked less than pleased. "A community effort to feed our children, I like it," Mayor Thornton said. "Let's put it to a vote then. Those in favor of building the new school behind the church, with provisions for a kitchen, raise your hands." The majority of hands went up, including Marshall's, who caught Eliza's eye and nodded approvingly. Motion carried, the mayor declared. Now, let's enjoy some of Miss Dawson's famous pies while we discuss the particulars of funding. As the meeting dissolved into smaller conversations, Eliza slipped to the back of the room to serve the pies. She felt a small sense of pride in having spoken up and, more surprisingly, in having been heard. Marshall appeared at her side as she was cutting slices. "That was well said, Miss Dawson. The children of Silver City are fortunate to have such an advocate." "I merely spoke from observation," she replied, though his praise warmed her. "Here's your blackberry pie as promised." He accepted the plate with a smile. "May I ask a rather forward question?" Eliza paused, her serving knife hovering above another pie. "You may." "Would you consider accompanying me to church this Sunday? And perhaps to dinner afterward at the hotel?" The question was so unexpected that Eliza nearly dropped the knife. Surely this was some kind of jest, or worse, a dare from the other men. She glanced around, half expecting to see snickering onlookers, but the nearby townsfolk seemed occupied with their own conversations. "Deputy Marshal, I don't understand what you're asking," she finally managed to say. His expression remained earnest without a hint of mockery. "I'm asking for the pleasure of your company, Miss Dawson. I've admired your kindness and your spirit since I arrived in Silver City, and I would like to know you better." Eliza's mind raced with confusion and disbelief. Men like Marshall Hayes didn't court women like her. It defied the natural order of things as she had come to understand it. "This isn't some kind of joke." The words escaped before she could stop them, and she immediately regretted her bluntness. To her surprise, Marshall's expression softened with understanding rather than offense. "No joke, Miss Dawson, just a man who recognizes quality when he sees it." She studied his face, searching for any sign of deception, but found only sincerity. "Then yes," she heard herself say, "I would be honored to accompany you." His smile brightened considerably. "Wonderful. I'll call for you at 10 on Sunday morning if that's suitable?" "Yes, that would be fine." As Marshall rejoined the sheriff with his pie, Eliza caught Aunt Harriet watching her with a knowing smile. The older woman winked before returning to her conversation with Mrs. Cooper. For the remainder of the evening, Eliza moved through her duties in a daze, scarcely able to believe what had transpired. By the time she and Aunt Harriet were loading the empty pie plates back into the wagon, news of the deputy's invitation had spread through the gathering, generating curious glances and whispered conversations. "Seems you've caught the eye of the most eligible bachelor in Silver City," Aunt Harriet remarked as they drove home beneath a canopy of stars. "I can't imagine why," Eliza replied honestly. "Can't you? You're intelligent, kind, hardworking, and despite what those gossips would have you believe, quite beautiful." Aunt Harriet clicked her tongue at the horse to urge it forward. "Marshall Hayes strikes me as a man who sees beyond appearances to a person's true worth." "Or perhaps he simply has a fondness for blackberry pie," Eliza suggested, though she couldn't entirely suppress the hope blooming in her chest. "Then he's a man of excellent taste," her aunt declared, ending the conversation with a satisfied nod. Sunday arrived with a clarity of light that seemed to reflect Eliza's nervous anticipation. She had spent the previous days alternating between excitement and dread, convinced that Marshall would come to his senses and retract his invitation. Yet as the church bells began to toll across Silver City, a knock at the bakery door signaled his arrival. Aunt Harriet had already left for church, giving Eliza privacy to prepare herself. She had chosen her newest dress, a moss green that complemented her auburn hair, and had pinned a small cameo brooch her mother's at her collar. Marshall stood on the doorstep, hat in hand, looking every inch the respectable deputy in his dark suit. His eyes widened appreciatively as she opened the door. "Miss Dawson, you look lovely," he said, offering his arm. "Thank you," she replied, locking the door behind her and accepting his arm with a self-consciousness she couldn't quite shake. "You look quite handsome yourself." They walked toward the church, and Eliza was painfully aware of the stares from people they passed. Some nodded politely, their curiosity evident, while others made little effort to hide their surprise or disapproval. "Fine day for a stroll," Marshall commented, seeming oblivious to the attention they were attracting. "Indeed," Eliza agreed, though her throat felt tight with anxiety. As they approached the white steepled church, Charlotte White and her circle of friends stood near the entrance, their hushed conversation halting abruptly at the sight of Eliza on the deputy's arm. "Deputy Hayes," Charlotte greeted, her smile directed solely at Marshall. "What a pleasure to see you this morning." "Miss White," he acknowledged with a polite nod, but his hand covered Eliza's where it rested on his arm, a gesture that didn't go unnoticed by Charlotte or her friends. They proceeded into the church, where Marshall led Eliza to a pew near the front, traditionally occupied by the town's more prominent citizens. As they settled in, Sheriff and Mrs. Cooper joined them, exchanging pleasant greetings. "Miss Dawson, so glad you could join us this morning, Mrs. Cooper said warmly. "Your suggestion about the school kitchen has been the talk of the town. I've already received offers of assistance from several families." "That's wonderful news," Eliza replied, genuinely pleased. Throughout the service, Eliza was conscious of Marshall's solid presence beside her. He sang the hymns in a surprisingly pleasant baritone and listened attentively to Reverend Parker's sermon on compassion and community. Occasionally, his arm would brush against hers, sending an inexplicable thrill through her body. After the service, as congregants filed out into the churchyard, Marshall kept Eliza at his side, introducing her to people she'd known for years but had never truly conversed with. To her amazement, they responded with polite interest, asking her opinion on the school project or complimenting her baking. "Deputy Hayes," Mayor Thornton approached with his wife. "Miss Dawson, excellent sermon today, wasn't it?" "Very enlightening," Marshall agreed. "Miss Dawson and I were just discussing the possibility of organizing a baking demonstration to raise funds for the school kitchen." Eliza blinked in surprise. They had discussed no such thing but quickly recovered. "Yes, I thought perhaps a series of lessons with participants contributing a small fee." "Capital idea," the mayor enthused. "Martha, didn't you mention wanting to learn Miss Dawson's secret to flaky pie crust?" Mrs. Thornton nodded, looking somewhat taken aback to be put on the spot. "I did indeed. I would happily participate in such a class." As they continued their conversation, Eliza caught sight of Mrs. White and her daughter watching from across the churchyard, their expressions a mixture of confusion and displeasure. For perhaps the first time in her life, Eliza felt a sense of social advantage, and though she wasn't proud of the feeling, she couldn't entirely suppress it. When they finally made their way to the Silver City Hotel for dinner, Marshall guided Eliza to a table by the window overlooking the town's main street. The hotel restaurant was considered the finest establishment in Silver City, and Eliza had never dined there before. "Order whatever you like," Marshall encouraged as they perused the menus. "I hear the beef stew is particularly good today." "Have you eaten here often?" she asked, curious about his life before Silver City. "A few times since arriving." "It's a far cry from the trail food I was accustomed to during my years as a Texas Ranger." "You were a ranger." This new information intrigued her. "How did you come to Silver City?" Marshall smiled at her interest. "I served with the Rangers for 7 years after the war. Saw too much violence, decided I wanted something different. Sheriff Cooper wrote to my captain looking for a deputy, and here I am." He took a sip of water. "What about you? Have you always lived in Silver City?" Eliza shook her head. "I grew up in St. Louis. My father owned a bookshop and my mother helped him run it. After they both took ill with influenza 3 years ago, I came here to live with Aunt Harriet." "I'm sorry for your loss," Marshall said, his expression genuinely sympathetic. "That must have been difficult." "It was," she admitted. "But Aunt Harriet has been wonderful, and I've found purpose in the bakery." Their conversation flowed easily through the meal, Touching on books they'd read, Marshall had a surprising fondness for Dickens. Places they'd been, his travels far outstripped hers and their hopes for Silver City's future. "I believe this town has potential beyond mining," Marshall mused as they shared a dessert that Eliza noted was not nearly as good as what she could have made. With the railroad coming, it could become a real center of commerce for the territory. "I'd like to see more families settle here," Eliza said. "More children, more stability." "A woman with vision," Marshall smiled approvingly. "Silver City needs more citizens like you, Miss Dawson." As they left the hotel, Marshall suggested a walk before returning to the bakery. The afternoon sun cast a golden light over the town, softening its rough edges and highlighting its potential, just as Marshall had described. They strolled past the site where the new school would be built, Marshall pointing out where the kitchen might be located. "Your idea will make a real difference to many children," he told her. "It was brave of you to speak up at the meeting." "I'm not accustomed to having my opinion sought," she confessed. "Then the people of Silver City have been missing out." He guided her toward a bench beneath an old cottonwood tree on the edge of town. "May I ask you something personal, Miss Dawson?" She nodded, curious. "Why did you seem so surprised when I invited you today, as if you suspected some ulterior motive?" The directness of his question caught her off guard, and she hesitated, unsure how to respond without revealing too much of her insecurities. "You needn't answer if it makes you uncomfortable," he added quickly. "No, it's a fair question," she said, gathering her courage. "The truth is, men like you don't typically show interest in women like me. In my experience, when they do, it's usually at my expense." His brow furrowed. "What do you mean, women like you?" Eliza gestured to herself, feeling her cheeks heat with embarrassment. "I'm not blind to my appearance, Marshall. I know what people say about me in town." Understanding dawned in his eyes, followed by a flash of anger that surprised her. "You mean because you're not as slender as some? That's what this is about." She nodded, looking down at her hands folded in her lap. "Eliza," he said, using her first name for the first time, his voice gentle but firm. "Where I come from, a woman's worth isn't measured by the size of her waist, but by the strength of her character, the kindness in her heart, and the intelligence in her mind. You possess all these qualities in abundance." He reached out hesitantly, then seemed to make a decision and took her hand in his. "I invited you today because I admire you, because your smile lights up a room, and your voice speaking up for those children showed more courage than half the men in this town have ever displayed." Eliza looked up at him, searching his face for any sign of insincerity, but found only earnest regard. "I don't know what to say," she whispered. "Say you'll allow me to continue calling on you," he replied. "Say you'll give me the chance to show you that not everyone in Silver City is blind to your true value." A warmth spread through Eliza's chest, unfamiliar but not unwelcome. "I would like that very much, Marshall." His smile was like the sun breaking through clouds. "Then that's settled." He stood, offering his hand to help her up. "Shall we head back? I don't want to give your aunt cause for concern." As they walked back toward the bakery, Marshall kept Eliza's hand tucked in the crook of his arm, a public declaration of his interest that did not go unnoticed by the townspeople they passed. Word of their Sunday outing spread through Silver City like wildfire, fueled by speculation and, in some quarters, disbelief. The following days brought a curious increase in business to the bakery, as women who had previously sent servants to collect their orders now appeared in person, eager to observe the woman who had somehow captured Deputy Hayes's attention. "I'll take a dozen of those sugar cookies, Eliza, Mrs. Franklin requested, leaning conspiratorially across the counter. "And tell me, is it true that Deputy Hayes has invited you to the Founders' Day dance next month?" Eliza carefully wrapped the cookies in paper. "He mentioned it yesterday when he stopped by for coffee, yes, Mrs. Franklin's eyebrows rose. "How lovely. You know, my Margaret has been taking dancing lessons specially for the occasion. Perhaps she could give you some pointers." "That's very kind, but I learned to dance in St. Louis," Eliza replied evenly, though the implication stung. "That will be 25 cents for the cookies." After Mrs. Franklin left, Aunt Harriet emerged from the kitchen, wiping flour from her hands. "That woman has the subtlety of a mule kick." Eliza laughed despite herself. "She means well, I suppose." "She means to gather gossip," Aunt Harriet corrected. "But let her talk. You've nothing to be ashamed of, and neither does Marshall." True to his word, Marshall continued to call on Eliza regularly. He escorted her to church each Sunday, joined her and Aunt Harriet for dinner twice a week, and often appeared at the bakery for brief visits during his rounds. Each time, his genuine interest in her thoughts and feelings became more apparent, and Eliza found herself growing more comfortable in his presence. One evening, as they sat on the bakery's small back porch watching the sunset paint the distant mountains, Marshall shared more of his past. "My father was a farmer in Tennessee before the war," he told her. "Taught me that the measure of a man was his honesty and his willingness to work hard, not his possessions or status." "He sounds like a wise man," Eliza observed. "He lost him at Shiloh when I was 16. My mother followed a year later grief, the doctor said, though I think it was more her heart simply couldn't bear to continue without him." "I'm sorry," Eliza said softly, understanding all too well the pain of losing both parents. "It was a long time ago," Marshall replied, though his eyes reflected old sorrow. "I joined the Army after that, then the Rangers when the war ended. Never really had a place to call home until Silver City." Eliza hesitated, then asked, "And do you call it home now, I mean?" His gaze met hers, warm and steady. "More so every day." As the Founders' Day dance approached, the entire town buzzed with preparations. The event commemorated the establishment of Silver City and was the social highlight of the year, with people coming from surrounding settlements to participate. Eliza had agreed to bake for the occasion, preparing dozens of pies, cakes, and cookies with Aunt Harriet's help. The day before the dance, as they worked in the bakery's sweltering kitchen, Charlotte White and her mother made an unexpected appearance. "Eliza, dear, Mrs. White's voice preceded her through the swinging door, ignoring the staff-only sign. "We simply must speak with you about tomorrow's arrangements." Eliza straightened from the oven where she'd been checking a batch of apple pies, wiping perspiration from her brow. "Mrs. White, Miss White, how may I help you?" Charlotte surveyed the kitchen with poorly disguised disdain, her slender figure showcased in an expensive day dress. "We're here about Deputy Hayes, actually." Aunt Harriet's head snapped up from her work at the preparation table. "What about him, Mrs. White smiled thinly. "Well, as members of the dance committee, we're concerned about appearances. The deputy, as our town's representative of law and order, should properly escort a young lady who reflects the, shall we say, aspirations of Silver City." Eliza felt as though she'd been doused with cold water. "I'm afraid I don't understand what you're suggesting, Mrs. White." "Oh, I think you do," Charlotte interjected, her pretty face hardening. "Deputy Hayes has been kind to you these past weeks, perhaps out of some misplaced sense of charity. But the Founders' Day dance is attended by important visitors from as far as Santa Fe. The optics of his escorting someone like you would be unfortunate." "Someone like me," Eliza repeated, her voice steady despite the hurt blooming in her chest. "Yes, well," Mrs. White gestured vaguely. "Someone of your stature. Charlotte, on the other hand, would make a most appropriate companion, reflecting the refinement we wish to present to our guests." Aunt Harriet's wooden spoon clattered against the mixing bowl. "Margaret White, I have known you for 20 years, but if you don't remove yourself and your daughter from my kitchen this instant, I will personally see to it that neither of you is served at any social function in this town for the next decade." Mrs. White drew herself up indignantly. "I am merely thinking of the town's reputation. You are thinking of your own selfish interests," Aunt Harriet cut in. "And insulting a woman who has done nothing but contribute positively to this community since her arrival. Now leave, before I forget my Christian virtues entirely." After a tense moment, Mrs. White sniffed haughtily and turned to go, Charlotte trailing behind with a last contemptuous glance at Eliza. When they were gone, Eliza sank onto a nearby stool, her hands trembling slightly. "Perhaps they have a point, Aunt Harriet." "Nonsense," her aunt declared firmly. "Those two are simply eaten up with jealousy. Charlotte has been trying to catch Marshall's eye since he arrived with no success, and now that he's shown interest in you, they can't stand it." Eliza wasn't entirely convinced, but she returned to her baking, determined not to let the Whites' visit ruin her anticipation of the dance. Yet as the day wore on, doubt crept in. What if Marshall was indeed acting out of kindness rather than genuine attraction? What if he would be embarrassed to have her on his arm at such a public event? By evening, when Marshall arrived to escort her and Aunt Harriet to dinner at the hotel, Eliza had worked herself into a state of anxious uncertainty. "You're quiet tonight," he observed as they walked back to the bakery afterward, Aunt Harriet having gone ahead to prepare for an early morning of baking. Eliza hesitated, then decided honesty was best. "I had visitors today, Mrs. White and Charlotte." Marshall's expression darkened slightly. "What did they want?" She recounted the conversation, trying to present it factually without revealing how deeply it had hurt her. "They seemed to think you might prefer Charlotte's company at the dance." To her surprise, Marshall laughed, though there was little humor in the sound. "Did they indeed? Well, that explains why Charlotte cornered me after church last Sunday with a sudden interest in law enforcement techniques." "You never mentioned that," Eliza said, a touch of insecurity in her voice. "Because it wasn't worth mentioning," he replied simply. "Eliza, look at me." She raised her eyes to his, finding them serious and intent. "I have no interest in Charlotte White or any other woman in Silver City. When I asked you to the dance, it was because there is no one else I wish to accompany. If you've changed your mind about going with me, I will respect that decision, but please don't let the spiteful words of jealous people influence you." The sincerity in his voice dispelled some of Eliza's doubts. "I haven't changed my mind," she assured him. "Good." His expression softened. "Because I've been practicing my waltz especially for the occasion, and it would be a shame to waste all that effort." Eliza laughed, her spirits lifting. "We can't have that, can we?" "Absolutely not," he agreed solemnly, though his eyes twinkled with good humor. They had reached the bakery, and he took her hand in his. "Until tomorrow, then." "Until tomorrow," she confirmed. Marshall surprised her by raising her hand to his lips, pressing a gentle kiss against her knuckles. "Dream sweetly, Eliza." As he walked away into the gathering dusk, Eliza touched the spot his lips had brushed, a warm glow spreading through her that had nothing to do with the summer heat. The day of the Founders' Day dance arrived clear and hot, typical for August in the New Mexico territory. Eliza and Aunt Harriet spent the morning delivering baked goods to the town hall, where the dance would be held. The large room had been transformed with bunting in patriotic colors, lanterns hanging from the rafters, and tables arranged around a cleared space for dancing. By mid-afternoon, Eliza returned home to prepare herself for the evening. Aunt Harriet had insisted on ordering a new dress for the occasion, a deep burgundy silk with delicate lace trim that complemented Eliza's fair skin and auburn hair. "You look beautiful, my dear," Aunt Harriet declared as she helped Eliza with the final touches, arranging her hair in an elegant style adorned with a small silver comb. "Marshall Hayes won't be able to take his eyes off you." "I'm nervous," Eliza admitted, smoothing the fabric of her dress. "Everyone will be watching us." "Let them watch," her aunt said firmly. "Hold your head high and remember that you have as much right to happiness as anyone in this town." When Marshall arrived, his appreciative gaze as Eliza descended the stairs confirmed Aunt Harriet's prediction. He was dressed in a formal black suit, his usual deputy's badge polished to a shine on his lapel. "You are a vision, Eliza," he said, his voice slightly husky. "I am the most fortunate man in the territory tonight," Aunt Harriet, who would join them later with Mrs. Cooper shooed them out the door with a satisfied smile. "Don't keep her out too late, Deputy." "I'll guard her with my life, Miss Harriet," Marshall promised, offering Eliza his arm. The town hall was already bustling with activity when they arrived. The local string band was tuning up in the corner, and townsfolk in their finest attire mingled around tables laden with food and drink. Heads turned as Marshall and Eliza entered, conversations pausing momentarily before resuming with renewed vigor. Sheriff Cooper approached them immediately, tipping his hat to Eliza. "Miss Dawson, you look lovely this evening. Deputy, you're a lucky man." "Don't I know it?" Marshall replied with a proud smile, Mayor and Mrs. Thornton joined them, followed by other prominent citizens who, to Eliza's surprise, greeted her with genuine warmth. Even Mr. White nodded politely, though his wife and daughter were notably absent from the initial welcoming committee. As the band struck up the first dance, Marshall led Eliza to the floor. "Remember, I've been practicing," he whispered as he took her in his arms. "So have I," she confessed, and indeed, they moved together with unexpected grace, Marshall leading confidently as Eliza followed. From the corner of her eye, Eliza caught sight of Charlotte White entering with her parents, the young woman's face falling visibly at the sight of Marshall and Eliza dancing. For once, Eliza felt no sympathy for Charlotte's disappointment. As the evening progressed, Eliza found herself enjoying the attention rather than shrinking from it. Marshall introduced her to visitors from neighboring settlements as Miss Eliza Dawson, the finest baker in the territory and the most intelligent woman in Silver City. His obvious admiration drew curious looks but also respectful nods. During a break in the dancing, while Marshall fetched them punch, Eliza overheard a conversation between two women she didn't recognize. "That's her, the deputy's sweetheart," one said in a hushed tone. "I heard she spoke up at the town meeting and convinced everyone to build a kitchen for the school children." "How admirable," the other replied, "and look how she carries herself, such dignity." Eliza felt a warm flush of pleasure at their words. It was the first time she had heard herself discussed with approval rather than derision. Marshall returned with their drinks, his expression concerned. "Is everything all right? You look flushed." "Everything is perfect," she assured him, accepting the punch gratefully. Later, as the evening cooled, Marshall suggested they step outside for some fresh air. The town hall's small porch overlooked Silver City, now twinkling with lights against the backdrop of the star-filled desert sky. "I've been wanting to speak with you privately all evening," Marshall said, his voice low and serious. "There's something I need to tell you, Eliza." Her heart quickened with sudden apprehension. "What is it?" "I've received a letter from the territorial governor. He's offered me a position as marshal for the entire southwestern district." "Oh," Eliza said, trying to process what this meant. "That's a great honor." "It is," he agreed, "but it would mean traveling extensively, being away from Silver City for weeks at a time." He paused, studying her face in the soft light spilling from the hall's windows. "Unless I had a reason to make Silver City my permanent home base." Eliza's breath caught as she understood his meaning. "And do you have such a reason?" Marshall took both her hands in his. "I believe I do. Or at least I hope I do." He drew a deep breath. "Eliza Dawson, in the months I've known you, you have captured my heart more thoroughly than I ever thought possible. Your kindness, your courage, your beautiful spirit, everything about you calls to me in a way no woman ever has before." Eliza stood motionless, scarcely breathing as he continued. "I know this may seem sudden, but I'm a man who recognizes what he wants when he finds it. And what I want more than anything is to build a life with you if you'll have me." "Marshall," she whispered, overwhelmed by his declaration. "I'm not asking for an immediate answer," he hastened to add. "I want you to be certain, but I needed you to know my intentions are serious and honorable." Emotion welled up in Eliza's throat, making speech difficult. This man, this wonderful man who could have chosen anyone, wanted her. Not out of pity or charity, but out of genuine love and respect. "I don't need time," she finally managed to say. My answer is yes. Yes to everything you're offering, Marshall. Joy blazed across his face, and he pulled her into his arms, holding her as though she were precious beyond measure. "May I kiss you, Eliza?" he murmured against her hair. "Please," she replied, her heart hammering with anticipation. His lips met hers gently at first, then with growing passion as she responded to him. In that moment, all of Eliza's doubts and insecurities melted away, replaced by the certainty that she was exactly where she belonged. When they finally broke apart, Marshall rested his forehead against hers. "I love you, Eliza Dawson. I think I have since the first day I tasted your apple turnover." She laughed softly. "Is that all it took? I should have baked for you sooner." "It wasn't just the turnover," he assured her with a smile. "It was the way your eyes lit up when you talked about your mother's recipes. The kindness you showed to the Miller children when they couldn't pay for their bread. The quiet dignity with which you face a town that hasn't always been kind to you." They might have continued their private celebration longer had the band not struck up a lively reel, drawing dancers back to the floor and prompting several people to step onto the porch for air. "Shall we return to the dance?" Marshall asked. "Or would you prefer to keep our news private for tonight?" Eliza considered for a moment. "Let's dance," she decided. "But perhaps we can share our news with Aunt Harriet and the Coopers afterward?" "Whatever makes you happy," he agreed, leading her back inside. As they rejoined the festivities, Eliza noticed a subtle change in how people regarded her. Whether it was the confidence that came from Marshall's declaration of love or simply the joy radiating from within her, she felt different, stronger, more assured of her place in the world. When the final dance ended near midnight, Marshall gathered Aunt Harriet, Sheriff and Mrs. Cooper, and Mayor and Mrs. Thornton for a private word in the mayor's office adjacent to the hall. "Friends," Marshall began, his arm secure around Eliza's waist, "we wanted you to be the first to know. I've asked Miss Dawson to marry me, and she has done me the great honor of accepting." Aunt Harriet's delighted cry was followed by congratulations from the others, with Mrs. Cooper embracing Eliza warmly and the sheriff clapping Marshall on the back. "This calls for a toast," Mayor Thornton declared, producing a bottle of fine whiskey from his desk drawer. "To Deputy Hayes and the future Mrs. Hayes, may your life together be long and joyful." As they raised their glasses, Eliza caught sight of her reflection in the office window, flushed with happiness, standing tall beside the man she loved, surrounded by people who seemed genuinely pleased for them. It was a far cry from the woman who had stared into a cracked mirror months earlier, trying to steel herself against the town's cruelty. News of their engagement spread through Silver City by the following morning. Aunt Harriet reported that the bakery had been inundated with well-wishers, many of whom had previously avoided direct interaction with Eliza. Mrs. Franklin asked if you might consider making her daughter's wedding cake next spring, Aunt Harriet said with amusement as she and Eliza prepared Sunday dinner. "Apparently your talents are suddenly in high demand. How convenient," Eliza remarked dryly, though without bitterness. The town's hypocrisy was too transparent to wound her now. Marshall arrived for dinner in high spirits, having spent the morning writing to the territorial governor to accept the marshal position with the condition that Silver City would be his headquarters. "He'll agree," Marshall assured them as they sat down to eat. "Silver City's central location makes it a logical choice, and with the railroad coming, it's only going to become more important." "Have you thought about where you'll live after the wedding?" Aunt Harriet inquired. "The rooms above the bakery are hardly suitable for a married couple." Marshall and Eliza exchanged glances. "Actually," he said, "I've had my eye on the Henderson property at the edge of town. Old man Henderson is moving to California to live with his daughter, and the house is for sale. It's modest but well built, with plenty of room for a family someday." Eliza blushed at the implication, though the thought of children with Marshall filled her with a quiet joy. "When do you plan to marry?" Aunt Harriet asked, practical as always. "As soon as possible," Marshall replied firmly. I've waited long enough to find the right woman. I see no reason to postpone making her my wife. October would be lovely, Eliza suggested. After the worst of the summer heat but before winter sets in. October it is, Marshall agreed with a smile that made her heart skip. The weeks leading up to the wedding were a whirlwind of preparations. Marshall purchased the Henderson house and began making improvements, enlisting the help of friends to add a larger kitchen that would allow Eliza to continue her baking experiments. Eliza, meanwhile, worked on her wedding dress with Aunt Harriet and Mrs. Cooper, selecting a pattern that flattered her figure rather than attempting to disguise it. Not everyone in Silver City approved of the match, of course. The White family maintained a chilly distance, and certain older residents muttered about unsuitable pairings. But as Marshall's position as territorial marshal became official, bringing additional prestige to the town, even the critics found it difficult to openly disparage the engagement. One afternoon in late September, as Eliza was arranging a display of cinnamon rolls in the bakery window, she noticed Charlotte White approaching with determined steps. Steeling herself for an unpleasant encounter, Eliza was surprised when Charlotte entered the shop alone without her usual entourage. "Good afternoon, Miss White," Eliza greeted her neutrally. "How may I help you?" Charlotte hesitated, her usual confidence seemingly diminished. I came to order a cake for my birthday next week, of course. What kind would you prefer?" "The lemon cake with raspberry filling that you made for the Founders' Day dance," Charlotte said. "It was exceptional," Eliza blinked, taken aback by the compliment. "Thank you. I'd be happy to prepare one for you." As she wrote down the order details, Charlotte cleared her throat. "I also wanted to say, that is, I feel I should apologize for my behavior before the dance. It was unkind and unworthy." Now thoroughly surprised, Eliza set down her pencil. "That's very gracious of you, Miss White." Charlotte twisted her gloved hands together. "My mother doesn't know I'm here. She wouldn't approve. But I've been thinking about how I would feel if someone treated me the way I've treated you, and I realized I wouldn't like it at all." She paused, then added quietly, "Deputy Hayes Marshal Hayes now, I suppose, is a good man. He deserves someone who makes him happy, and it's clear that you do." Eliza studied the younger woman, seeing past her pretty face to the insecurity beneath. "Thank you, Charlotte. That means a great deal to me." With a nod that seemed part acknowledgement, part embarrassment, Charlotte turned to leave. At the door, she paused. "Will you still teach those baking classes for the school fundraiser?" "I will," Eliza confirmed. "Would it be possible for me to attend?" "I should like to learn to bake properly." Eliza smiled, recognizing the olive branch for what it was. "The first class is next Tuesday at 4. You would be most welcome." After Charlotte left, Aunt Harriet emerged from the kitchen where she'd been unashamedly eavesdropping. "Well, I never," she marveled. "Wonders never cease in this town. People can change," Eliza observed, though she was as surprised as her aunt by Charlotte's visit. "Some can," Aunt Harriet agreed, "when they're shown a better way." October arrived with clear skies and a gentle breeze, perfect weather for a wedding. The ceremony was held in the church, which was filled to capacity with townsfolk and visitors from surrounding areas, including several dignitaries who came to witness the marriage of the new territorial marshal. Eliza wore a gown of ivory silk, its design elegant in its simplicity, with her mother's cameo at her throat and orange blossoms in her hair. As Sheriff Cooper escorted her down the aisle in place of her father, she saw only Marshall waiting for her at the altar, his expression one of awe and adoration. "Dearly beloved," Reverend Parker began, and Eliza felt a sense of surreal joy as the ceremony proceeded. When Marshall slipped the gold band onto her finger and pronounced his vows in a clear, steady voice, she knew with absolute certainty that this was right, that they were right together. The reception was held in the town hall, transformed once again with flowers and ribbons. Eliza and Marshall danced the first waltz as husband and wife, moving together as though they had been partners for years rather than months. "Mrs. Hayes," Marshall murmured as they circled the floor. "I like the sound of that." "So do I," Eliza replied, her heart so full she thought it might burst with happiness. As other couples joined them on the dance floor, Eliza caught glimpses of familiar faces: Aunt Harriet dancing with Mayor Thornton, Mrs. Cooper laughing at something her husband said, even Charlotte White smiling as she danced with a young banker from Santa Fe. Later, as they prepared to leave for their new home, Eliza threw her bouquet into the crowd of unmarried women. To everyone's surprise, it was caught by Mrs. Franklin's daughter Margaret, who blushed furiously as the young blacksmith's apprentice she'd been sweet on let out a whoop of approval. Marshall helped Eliza into the decorated wagon that would carry them to their home. "Ready for our new life, Mrs. Hayes?" he asked, his eyes reflecting the starlight above. "More than ready," she assured him, taking his hand in hers. As they drove away amid cheers and well wishes, Eliza reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. From the lonely woman who had been the butt of cruel jokes to the respected wife of the territorial marshal, it seemed like a fairy tale. Yet it was real. Their home welcomed them with lamplight glowing in the windows, thanks to Aunt Harriet who had gone ahead to prepare it. Inside, a fire crackled in the hearth, and the rooms were adorned with simple but elegant furnishings that they had chosen together. In the privacy of their bedroom, Marshall took Eliza in his arms with reverent tenderness. "I've waited so long for this moment," he whispered against her skin. "To finally have you as my wife, to show you how deeply I love you." Their union that night was a beautiful discovery of each other, Marshall's gentle hands and loving words erasing any lingering doubts Eliza might have harbored about her desirability. In his eyes, she was perfect, and his passion left no room for self-consciousness. In the weeks and months that followed, the newlyweds settled into a rhythm of life that accommodated both Marshall's duties as territorial marshal and Eliza's continued involvement with the bakery. True to his agreement with the governor, Marshall made Silver City his base of operations, though his work sometimes required travel to other settlements in the territory. During his absences, Eliza divided her time between their home and helping Aunt Harriet at the bakery. She also began teaching regular baking classes as fundraisers for the school kitchen, which had become a successful program providing daily meals to children in need. To her ongoing surprise, these classes attracted women from all levels of Silver City society, including Mrs. White who, following her daughter's example, eventually thawed toward Eliza. While they never became close friends, they developed a civil relationship based on mutual respect for their roles in the community. As winter gave way to spring, Eliza discovered she was expecting their first child. When she shared the news with Marshall upon his return from a trip to Santa Fe, his reaction was one of unbridled joy. "A baby," he marveled, his hand gently cradling her still flat stomach. "Our child, Eliza, I can scarcely believe it." "Believe it," she laughed, covering his hand with hers. "According to Dr. Wilson, we should welcome our little one around November." Marshall insisted on announcing the news to the entire town, proudly informing anyone who would listen that his brilliant, beautiful wife was carrying the future of Silver City. His unabashed adoration continued to surprise those who had once believed Eliza unworthy of such devotion, gradually changing perceptions until even the most stubborn critics were won over. As Eliza's pregnancy progressed, her confidence in herself grew stronger. The woman who had once hidden in the bakery kitchen now presided over community meetings about the school kitchen program, spoke up at town council sessions regarding children's welfare, and even organized Silver City's first harvest festival, which quickly became a beloved annual tradition. On a crisp November morning, after a labor that tested her strength but never her determination, Eliza gave birth to a healthy son whom they named Thomas after Marshall's father. "He's perfect," Marshall whispered, cradling the infant with careful hands that had once handled guns and outlaws but now held something infinitely more precious. Just like his mother. Eliza watched them, exhausted but filled with a profound sense of completion. The family she had created with Marshall was everything she had never dared to hope for, built on love, respect, and mutual admiration that defied the shallow judgments of the world. As Thomas grew from infant to toddler, the Hayes household became a center of community life in Silver City. Marshall's position brought a steady stream of visitors, officials from the territorial government, fellow lawmen seeking advice, even the occasional reformed outlaw paying respects to the man who had shown them mercy rather than the hanging rope. Eliza welcomed them all with the grace and confidence of a woman secure in her place in the world. Her table became known throughout the territory for its generous hospitality and exceptional food, and an invitation to dine with Marshall and Mrs. Hayes was highly coveted. By the time Thomas was 2, the railroad had reached Silver City, bringing new prosperity and growth to the town. The station house restaurant contracted exclusively with Eliza for its baked goods, and she hired 2 young women from the mining families to help meet the demand, teaching them the skills that would provide stable employment for years to come. On their 3rd wedding anniversary, Marshall surprised Eliza with a small jewelry box containing a pair of diamond earrings. "For the woman who makes me proud every day," the accompanying note read. "They're beautiful, Marshall," she said, touching the sparkling stones with wonder. "But far too extravagant." "Nothing is too extravagant for you," he insisted, helping her put them on. "Besides, I have more news to celebrate. The governor has offered me a position on the Territorial Supreme Court. If I accept, we would need to spend part of each year in Santa Fe, but Silver City would remain our primary home." Eliza considered this development. "You would make an excellent judge, Marshall. You have a natural sense of fairness and compassion." "I wanted your thoughts before making any decision," he said. "This would affect our whole family." The fact that he valued her opinion so highly, even in matters of his career, was one of the many reasons Eliza loved him so deeply. "I think you should accept," she said after careful consideration. "Thomas and I can accompany you to Santa Fe when the court is in session. It would be educational for him as he grows older." Marshall nodded thoughtfully. "And perhaps good for you as well. Santa Fe has a flourishing cultural life. Art, music, literature, things that Silver City still lacks despite its growth." "Are you suggesting I've become provincial, Judge Hayes?" she teased. Using the title he had not yet earned, he laughed, pulling her into an embrace. "Never. I'm suggesting that a woman of your talents and intelligence deserves every opportunity to explore the world, and I intend to provide those opportunities for as long as I live." True to his word, when Marshall accepted the judgeship the following year, their life expanded to include seasonal residence in Santa Fe. Eliza discovered a passion for art and literature that had been dormant since her father's bookshop days, and she began collecting both for their Silver City home, which grew to include a dedicated library and small gallery. Thomas thrived with exposure to 2 different environments, developing into a thoughtful, curious child with his father's sense of justice and his mother's compassion. By the time he was 5, he had a sister, Sarah, named after Eliza's mother, who inherited Eliza's auburn hair and Marshall's penetrating blue eyes. Life was not without its challenges. Marshall's position occasionally made him a target for those who disagreed with his rulings or harbored grudges from his days as a lawman. Twice during their years together, Eliza faced the heart-stopping fear of waiting while her husband recovered from injuries sustained in the line of duty. During one such period, as Marshall recuperated from a bullet wound received while defending a courthouse from an angry mob, Eliza sat by his bedside reading aloud from Dickens' David Copperfield, his favorite novel. "Do you ever regret it?" Marshall asked during a pause in her reading, his voice weak but his mind clear. "Regret what?" she asked, setting the book aside to take his hand. "Marrying me. Taking on this life with all its dangers and uncertainties." Eliza considered his question seriously, knowing he deserved an honest answer. "Not for a single moment," she finally said. Every day with you has been a gift, Marshall, even the difficult ones." He squeezed her hand, his strength returning slowly. "When I first came to Silver City, I was searching for something without knowing what it was. Then I tasted your apple turnover, saw your smile, and realized what I'd been missing my entire life." "A decent pastry," she suggested with mock innocence. Marshall laughed, then winced as the movement pulled at his wound. "A home, Eliza, a true home. You gave me that, you with your courage and your kindness and your incredible heart." As he recovered and resumed his duties, their life settled back into its familiar pattern half the year in Silver City, where Eliza continued to oversee the bakery with Aunt Harriet and her growing staff, and half in Santa Fe, where Judge Marshall Hayes became known for his fair but firm jurisprudence. When Thomas turned 10, demonstrating an aptitude for law that surprised no one, Marshall began including him in carefully selected court sessions, nurturing his son's natural interest. Sarah, meanwhile, showed Eliza's talent for baking but combined it with an artistic flair, creating confections that were as beautiful as they were delicious. The children grew up knowing the story of how their parents had found each other, how their father had recognized true worth when others had been blind to it, and how their mother had overcome the cruelty of narrow minds to become one of the most respected women in the territory. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Marshall and Eliza hosted a grand celebration at their Silver City home, now expanded to accommodate their growing family and frequent guests. The guest list included territorial officials, local dignitaries, and longtime friends who had witnessed their journey from the beginning. A toast, Sheriff Cooper, now retired but still robust, called out as dinner concluded. "To Judge and Mrs. Hayes, who taught Silver City the true meaning of value. May the next 10 years bring you as much joy as the first." Glasses raised around the table, and Eliza felt the familiar warmth of Marshall's hand covering hers. At 42, she remained a substantial woman, her figure softened further by motherhood, but the self-consciousness that had once plagued her was long gone. In its place was the quiet confidence of a woman who knew her worth not because of her husband's position or society's approval, but because she had earned it through her own merit. Later that evening, after the guests had departed and the children were asleep, Marshall found Eliza in their garden, gazing up at the star-filled desert sky. "What are you thinking about, my love?" he asked, wrapping his arms around her from behind. "About how far we've come," she replied, leaning back against his solid warmth. "About the girl who used to avoid town gatherings for fear of mockery and the woman who just hosted the governor for dinner. You were always that woman," Marshall said, his breath warm against her hair. "You just needed someone to remind you of it." Eliza turned in his arms, looking up at the face that had grown dearer to her with each passing year. The lines at the corners of his eyes spoke of laughter shared, the gray at his temples of challenges weathered together. "I love you, Marshall Hayes," she said simply, "more today than the day we wed." "And I love you, Eliza Hayes," he replied, his voice husky with emotion, "more than words can ever express." As they stood together under the vast New Mexico sky, Eliza reflected on the journey that had brought her from ridicule to respect, from loneliness to love. The path had not always been easy, but every step had led her here to this moment of perfect contentment in the arms of the man who had seen her true self when no one else had bothered to look. In the years that followed, as their children grew and Silver City continued to evolve from frontier town to established community, Eliza and Marshall remained its moral center examples of how love based on genuine respect could weather any storm and overcome any prejudice. And when young women of substantial size visited Eliza's bakery, uncertain of their place in a world that valued appearance over character, she would share her story with them, the story of a woman once mocked for her size who had found not just acceptance but adoration, not despite her differences, but because of the strength of character they had helped her develop. "True worth," she would tell them, echoing the wisdom Marshall had shared with her so many years ago, is measured not by the size of your waist but by the size of your heart, the scope of your mind, and the strength of your spirit. Never let anyone convince you otherwise. It was a lesson Silver City had learned through the example of Eliza, and Marshall Hayes a legacy more lasting than any court ruling or award-winning pie could ever be.